المنير المصطفى الأمجد أبا القاسم محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المظلومين وعلى أصحابه الغر الميامين. أما بعد، يقول الله في المحكم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: ومن يهاجر في سبيل الله يجد في الأرض مراغما كثيرا وسعا ومن يخرج من بيته مهاجرا إلى الله ورسوله ثم يدركه الموت فقد وقع أجره على الله وكان الله غفور رحيما. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات. Migration or movement is a universal property of life. You'll notice that every organism at one time or another during its lifetime will migrate a distance. For example, you have the well-known migration of the birds. Birds on an annual basis will migrate from the north to the south during the winter, and then they'll migrate back north during the summer. There are fish, for example, the salmon fish migrates when it's of a mature age, it migrates into the ocean, and then during spawning it'll migrate back into the fresh water. In fact, one of the greatest migrations occurs by the insects. There's an insect called the dragonfly, which is a very small insect, maybe about this large. And every year it migrates a distance of around 11,000 miles. It migrates from India to Africa and back to India. So a distance of 11,000 miles during its lifetime, which is approximately 2 generations. So it starts off as the father, and by the time they come back to India, you have the second generation coming back. The point being that there are many reasons that life forms migrate. Now, with respect to humans, we notice the same fundamental property. People migrate for many different reasons. Many of you have migrated here from Iran or from Iraq or wherever for economic and educational opportunities. So that's one reason that individuals migrate, for economic and educational opportunities. Another reason that people migrate is to escape political persecution. So sometimes people face various governmental pressures and they migrate to an area where they encounter greater freedom. And in fact, we notice that the prophets, nearly all of the prophets at one point or another during their lifetime underwent a migration. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam migrated from modern-day Palestine to the Hijaz, where he left his wife Hajar and their son Ismail, and he went back to Palestine. Prophet Ibrahim. Prophet Musa migrated from modern-day Palestine to Egypt, and then his people migrated out of Egypt back into Palestine. And probably the greatest migration to occur in the history of Islam was the migration of the Prophet ﷺ from Mecca to Medina. In fact, this is such an important event that our entire calendar is based on the year of migration, Am al-Hijri, the year after Hijrah. Unlike the Christian calendar, which dates its year by the year after the birth of Prophet Isa, or the birth of Christ, our calendar revolves around the migration of the Muslim Ummah from Mecca to Medina. So within this concept, tonight I wanted to talk about the Islamic perspective on migration. Because as this ayah talks about in Surah 4, ayah 100, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala articulates the importance of migration in the perspective of Allah. Let's break down this ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يُهَاجِرْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ يَجِدْ فِي الْأَرْضِ مُرَاغَمًا كَثِيرًا وَسَعًا. Whoever migrates for the sake of Allah will find abundant bounties, will find tremendous bounties and resources. That's whoever migrates for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ يَخْرُجْ مِنْ بَيْتِهِ, and whoever leaves his house, مُهَاجِرًا إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, and whoever leaves their house as a migrant for the sake of Allah and for the Prophet, ثُمَّ يُدْرِكُهُ الْمَوْتِ فَقَدْ وَقَعَ أَجْرَهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. And whoever migrates for the sake of Allah, and during their migration they die, their reward is already present. So simply the act of migrating for Allah is enough to earn the reward of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. So the point being, there are numerous hadith that talk about the value of migration over even the act of jihadun azghar. So a migrant, the ajr that a migrant will receive is greater than the ajr of a mujahid. So tonight we're going to talk about the three major physical migrations that occurred during the history of Islam. Specifically, we're going to talk about the migration to Ethiopia, the migration to Medina, and then the forced migration of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam from Medina to Khurasan to Thus, which is modern-day Mashhad. And the reason that we want to talk about these things is because we can learn a great deal from the example of the Prophet and from the example of Imam Musa al-Rida about their migration, specifically applied to our modern context in America today. Many of us are migrants, and many of the issues that we're facing in America today were the same issues that were faced by the Prophet ﷺ over 1400 years ago, and were the same issues that were faced by the migration of Imam Ali ibn Musa al-Rida over 1300 years ago. The point being that we reflect on their biography to learn lessons that we can apply in our modern context. Well, we hear a lot of talk about Islamophobia and how Islam is under attack. Let us look back into history to see how our prophets and our imams dealt with adversity, and how they dealt with adversity specifically through the instances of migration. But first, please give me a loud salawat. So the first major migration to occur in the history of Islam was the migration of a select group of people from the city of Mecca to modern-day Abyssinia, or modern-day Ethiopia. As all of you know, the early Muslims were under tremendous pressure. Anyone who publicly admitted to being a Muslim would be either beaten, or they would have rocks thrown at them, or they would be killed. We have the instances of Ammar ibn Yasir and Sumayya being killed, being the first martyrs of Islam, simply for declaring their shahada in public. Now when people talk about Islamophobia, I ask them, the situation today isn't worse than it was back then during the time of the Prophet. I mean, today you can say you're a Muslim, but no one is going to publicly kill you. At least the government isn't going to publicly kill you. Whereas that was a real threat for the early Muslims. If you publicly acknowledged your Islam, you would be tortured and beaten in public. We have that example with Bilal, we have that example with Ammar ibn Yasir, and we have that example with Sumayya. So the early Muslims were under tremendous pressure. And a select group of Muslims found that they weren't able to handle the pressure in Mecca. So they came to the Prophet and they said, Ya Rasulullah, give us some advice. We really can't handle the pressure of all of this, persecution. What shall we do? So the Prophet ﷺ told them, go to Abyssinia. There is a king, a peaceful Christian king over there, who is a God-loving and a God-fearing individual. Go to Abyssinia, migrate to Abyssinia, and he will give you protection under the auspices of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he assigns his cousin, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who is the brother of Imam Ali alayhi salam. So Ja'far ibn Abi Talib leads a contingent of about 80 people, 80 early Muslims. They leave Mecca and they make their way over to Ethiopia. Now what ends up happening is that the early Meccans, the people like Abu Sufyan and Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab, they find out about this a group of 80 Muslims going to Abyssinia, and what they do is they send a man named Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As is to go to the king in Abyssinia to give him gifts and to convince him to avoid giving refuge to the early Muslims. So notice the strategy here. The Muslims don't want to make any trouble. They want to leave the land of persecution, or the land of dhulm in Mecca during the time of Abu Jahl and Abu Sufyan, and they want to just go and make no trouble. But the early non-Muslims, again, going back to the concept of Islamophobia, wouldn't leave them alone, and they were so evil and so antagonistic that they had to send their own emissary to the king. So anyway, the early Muslims, they arrive in Abyssinia to the king of al-Najashi. And so in the court, what we have is we have the Muslims led by Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and on the other hand we have Amr ibn al-As. Amr ibn al-As is making a case to the king of Abyssinia. He says, "O king, these people that have come to your land, these are slaves, these owe debts. We want you to give them back to us so that we can punish them accordingly." The king smiles, and he's a just king, so he gives an opportunity to Ja'far ibn Abi Talib to give his case. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib comes and he makes the case for the Muslims. He says, O king, we were an ignorant people. But then Muhammad came to us, and he gave us the message of Islam. He taught us that the authentic submission is through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Amr ibn al-As couldn't answer to this. So then he resorts to another dirty tactic. He says, "O king, ask them what they say about Maryam, the Virgin Mary." They mention her in their book. So he thinks that he's going to turn the king against Ja'far ibn Abi Talib and the early Muslims. So the king becomes angry. He says, "What does your holy book say about our beloved Virgin Mary?" And this is where Ja'far ibn Abi Talib responds with the following ayah from Surah Maryam. وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ مَرْيَمَ إِذَا انْتَبَذَتْ مِنْ أَهْلِهَا مَكَانًا شَرْقِيًّا. And recite to them the instance of Maryam, the Virgin Mary, who fled her parents to a place in the east, مَكَانًا شَرْقِيًّا. And then he goes and he elaborates on the story of the Virgin Mary and Prophet Isa alayhi salam, the miraculous virgin birth. By the end of his recitation, the king, his beard is filled with tears because he's so emotionally touched. He says to him, "Our own books don't mention our beloved Virgin Mary to the same detail that your own books mention." And by the way, this is a fact. If you look at the Quran mentions Maryam alayhi salam more times than the entire New Testament mentions Mary. So in that instance, he says, "I grant you and your people amnesty and refuge here in Abyssinia. You can live as free individuals." Now there are many lessons that we can learn from this first migration from Mecca to Abyssinia. The first lesson is that when push comes to shove, if someone feels a compelling need to migrate, it is your obligation to migrate during times of adversity. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ تَوَفَّاهُمَ الْمَلَائِكَةُ ظَالِمِي أَنفُسَهُم قَالُوا فِيمَا كُنْتُمْ قَالُوا كُنَّا مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. So the people who say they were oppressed on the land, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will tell them, "Why did you stay in the same place?" They'll say, قَالُوا كُنَّا مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. They'll say to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "We were oppressed in our land." قَالُوا أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً. Allah will respond to them, "Was not Allah's earth expansive? Was not Allah's earth wide?" وَاسِعَةً فَتُهَاجِرُوا فِيهَا. So migrate in it. فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَأْوَاهُمْ جَهَنَّمْ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to the people who during times of oppression they complain and they say, "We're being oppressed." Allah will ask them, "Was not my earth wide enough?" And they'll say, "Yes, it was wide." And then they'll say, "Well, go ahead and migrate." فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَأْوَاهُمْ جَهَنَّمْ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. And if they don't migrate, when they do have the ability to migrate, then their masir or their destiny will be Jahannam. The point being, the first lesson that we can learn from this is that if you feel like you're under such pressure that you're a mustad'af or you're one of the oppressed people on earth, it is your religious obligation to migrate to a safer place. The Meccans didn't stay in Mecca and complain and say we were mustad'afin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet gave them the choice to go to a land which isn't perceived as a Muslim land. Abyssinia, Ethiopia, was the land of the Africans. But the Muslims migrated because they didn't have that geographic limitation that Islam is only in Mecca. This is something that many of us, this mentality, many of us have is still in our own minds. We think that the land of Allah is only in Iran or in Iraq or in modern day Al-Jazeera al-Arabiya. Whereas in reality, Allah's land is expansive. America is just as much the land of Allah as is Senegal, as is Ethiopia, as is India, as is everything. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is first telling us that during times of adversity, you have the opportunity to migrate to a place because Allah's earth is expansive. The second lesson that we can learn here is the importance of forming alliances with people that aren't like you. Notice what the Prophet ﷺ did. His recommendation was for the early Muslims to go to a Christian, an African, in a land that was thousands of miles away. He formed a strategic alliance with a partner that had the same principles and the same values. Now today in America, many of the Muslims are feeling under attack. But the question is, are we forming these same types of alliances with people that share our values and our principles? Meaning, there are many people who believe in the rights of others. You have, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union. You have, for example, various church and Jewish organizations that believe in worshiping God, that believe in community service. But what are we doing as Muslims during these times of perceived adversity to make strategic alliances with these other communities? Are we simply complaining to ourselves and saying, look how much mustad'afin we are, look how oppressed we are, no one likes us, Islamophobia, Donald Trump, we just cry all the time and we say, look how oppressed we are? Or are we thinking strategically like the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was? Are we thinking strategically in that, are we making alliances with communities that have similar values to us? And I was mentioning this earlier today. In a few weeks, we have a tremendous opportunity to do community outreach with church organizations here in San Diego and in other communities. What do I mean? What celebration are the Christians celebrating in a few weeks? Christmas. In a few weeks, Muslims also have a important celebration. Does anyone know? The Prophet's birthday. So here we have an opportunity to join with the Christians. They're celebrating the birth of their Prophet. We're celebrating the birth of our Prophet. Why not have a universal celebration of the Prophets? We believe in the message of the Prophet Isa just as much as the Christians do. And this is an opportunity for them to understand the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in a universally welcoming way. It's not like we have a lecture or a speech. Everyone loves to celebrate. And what better celebration than the celebration of the greatest of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. So this is an opportunity that Allah has given us during this time of perceived difficulty. Are we going to strategically use it like the Prophet did during his time when he made an alliance with the Christian king? Or are we just going to simply turn this opportunity away and just continue to complain and say, look how much they don't like the Muslims, look how much they're ignoring us? Well, how can they like us if they don't know us? If you don't know an individual, they're not going to have the onus or the responsibility of liking you. You have to make the effort in order for people to reach out to you. Salawat. And the third lesson that we can learn from the early migration to Ethiopia is the importance of knowing our own history and being able to communicate effectively with other people. Meaning what? Meaning, look at how Ja'far ibn Abi Talib responded to the Abyssinian king. He was fully knowledgeable of his own religion. So when the Abyssinian king asked him, what does your book say about Maryam? Ja'far ibn Abi Talib didn't say, well, let me think about it, or, I don't know what my book says. He came up with the response right away because he knew his own religion, and more importantly, he knew how to talk to the Christian king. Now, the biggest deficiency, I would say, in modern day, in the West, is many of us Muslims, we don't know about our own history. We don't know about our own religion. So when it's under attack, we don't really have an effective way to arm ourselves or to respond accordingly. The third lesson that we can learn is that we need to know our own history. We need to educate ourselves about what Islam says about various things. And the best way to educate yourself of course, in addition to reading on your own, is to come to events like this. Come to the masjid on a regular basis, once a week. This is an opportunity to learn from the Sayyid and to learn from each other. Maybe your friend had an experience, maybe your brother in Islam or your sister in Islam had an experience. This is the greatest venue for us to come together and to learn as a community. Unfortunately, many of us, we don't take this responsibility seriously. Yesterday I talked about the responsibility of obtaining ilm. Many of us, we say we're seeking ilm, but how often are we coming to the venues that are providing ilm, like the masajid or like these other facilities? So the third point being that in order to communicate with the non-Muslims about Islam, we first have to know about Islam. We can't just be talking nonsense because we lack the credibility, and it's selling Islam short. So these are the three lessons that we can learn from this first important migration during the history of early Islam. First lesson, migrating during times of adversity, forming alliances while in exile, and the importance of knowing our history. In the second part, I'm going to talk about the second most important migration in the history of Islam, and that's the migration from Mecca to Medina. But first, please give me a loud salawat. So then the situation continued to get worse. The Meccans were continuing to oppress the early Muslims, but what ended up happening is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives a tremendous rahmah, or a tremendous piece of salvation to the Prophet, a tremendous opportunity. The people of the neighboring city of Yathrib, or modern day Medina, had some tribal quarrels between themselves. So they needed a mediator. They needed someone to come and to solve their problems for them. So they extended an invitation to the Prophet ﷺ, and they said, come to our city of Medina, solve our problems for us, and you can rule over us, essentially. So the Prophet goes to Medina. He solves the conflict between the warring tribes of Al-Aws and Al-Khazraj, and then the entire early Muslim community migrates along with him from Mecca to Medina. Now what ends up happening is that the entire city of Medina, the tribes of Aws and Khazraj, convert to Islam. They become what are known as the Ansar, or the helpers of the Prophet in the city of Medina. So they were the ones who were established in the city. They were the ones who had homes and had businesses in the community. They were the Muslims that converted to Islam after the Prophet migrated to Medina. They were the native Medinans. But what ended up happening is you have an influx of Meccans coming into the city of Medina as well. These were the muhajirun, or the migrants. These were people that left their houses, their businesses, their properties, all behind, and they migrated to Medina. Imagine the situation. You're migrating, you're leaving your entire life behind you, and you're going to this new land. So you have this potential conflict here. You have people that are well established, that have big houses potentially, that have businesses. And then you have people that maybe were materially advanced, and they've left all of that property and they've come to this new land. The Prophet acts very strategically during this hijrah. For every member of the Ansar, he assigns a brother from the Muhajirun. Meaning if you're a native citizen of Medina, you have a brother that you need to take care of, who's one of the Muhajirun. And this is one of the first acts that he does. So for example, Ammar ibn Yasir, his companion in Medina, or his brother in Medina, was Hudayfiyya al-Yamani. Umar ibn al-Khattab, his companion was Utbah ibn Malik. Abu Dhar al-Ghaffari, his brother in Medina was a man named al-Mundhir bin Amr. The only person left without a brother was Imam Ali alayhi salam, and he starts, tears start to form in his eyes. He goes to the Prophet. He says, Ya Rasulullah, you haven't assigned me a brother from among the Ansar. The Prophet smiles and says, Yeah, my dear Ali, you are my brother both in this world and in the hereafter. Meaning Imam Ali alayhi salam and the Prophet were united as brothers, both physically and spiritually in this world. The point being that this brotherhood is what enabled the early Muslim community to thrive. The brotherhood prevented animosity and racism, meaning the people of Medina couldn't say, oh, look at these people of Mecca. They're like the modern day, what we call the refugees. They had a responsibility to take care of these people. The early brotherhood prevented arrogance based on wealth, meaning the early Medinans couldn't say, well, those are the refugees from Mecca. We don't hang out with the refugees from Mecca. No, they actually had a responsibility to take care of these because these were their brothers in Islam. They had a material responsibility and they had a physical responsibility. In fact, it's really amazing when you reflect on the generosity of the early Medinans. There's a beautiful instance which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals an ayah about. It's a man named Abu Talha. Abu Talha was one of the Ansar in the city of Medina. And one day, a muhajir goes to the Prophet's masjid and he asks for a meal. The Prophet asks the community members and all of them say, we don't have anything to give this muhajir. So the Prophet tells the muhajir, go to the house of Abu Talha. Abu Talha welcomes this muhajir or this migrant. But he realizes that his house is empty of food as well. He doesn't have anything to spare. Whatever he gives away, that means that he'll lack a meal and his family will lack a meal. So, but what he ends up doing is he still wants to, take care of his responsibility or his amana. This is the amana that the Prophet sent to him. So he pretends that he and his family ate, and he gives all of the food that they have in their house to the muhajir. They give all of their food that they have for that particular day to the migrant. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals the following ayah, Surah 59, ayah 9. وَالَّذِينَ تَبَوَّأُوا الدَّارَ وَالْإِيمَانَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ يُحِبُّونَ مَنْ هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَا يَجِدُونَ فِي صُدُورِهِمْ حَاجَةً مِمَّا أُوتُوا وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانَ بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about الَّذِينَ يُحِبُّونَ Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about يُحِبُّونَ مَنْ هَاجَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ. They love the ones who have migrated to them, meaning the Ansar who love the muhajirs or the migrants. وَلَا يَجِدُونَ فِي صُدُورِهِمْ حَاجَةً. And they don't find anything in their chests or in their hearts. مِمَّا أُوتُوا وَيُؤْثِرُونَ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ وَلَوْ كَانُوا بِهِمْ خَصَاصَةٌ. And they force themselves to donate, even though they themselves are in a state of not really poverty, but in a state of stress, khasasa, in a state of stress. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling out the generosity of the early Medinans, of the early Ansar, in the way that they helped out their migrant brothers. Now what is the lesson that we can learn from this hijrah? The important lesson here is the importance of taking care of people that migrate to a new place after we've migrated. Meaning what? Meaning all of us in here, mashallah, have well-established careers and well-established houses and are very familiar with the community. Who's coming into the country recently? The refugees, right? Many of them are Muslims. Who's taking care of these Muslim refugees who are technically our brothers in Islam and we have a responsibility for? Unfortunately, there are very few Muslim organizations that are taking care of these refugees. They're primarily the greatest organization that's taking care of the Muslim refugees is an organization called Catholic Charities. Catholic Charities is the greatest donor or the greatest organization that's taking care of the Muslim refugees. The question becomes, the Muslims in America are really, physically and materially very prosperous. Many of them are engineers and doctors and lawyers and scientists. Why is it that the Muslim community can't take care of their own people? Why is it that the Catholic Charities are taking care of the Muslims? And I've noticed this firsthand. When I was in New Orleans, I was working with Catholic Charities because they had a lot of Iraqi refugees coming into the community. And Catholic Charities lacked people that spoke Arabic, so they would call on me every once in a while, and I would go there and I would translate for the Iraqi refugees when they went to medical appointments and what have you. And then I asked the lady one day, the lady at Catholic Charities, what percentage of your refugees are Muslims? And she said that the percentage of the refugees that were coming to New Orleans at that time was approximately 70%. 70% of the refugees that they were taking care of were Muslims. My point being, and I don't want to belabor the point here, is that, during times of adversity, we should always, make a point to help out our brothers in Islam that are less fortunate than us. And unfortunately, we have a tremendous opportunity here in the face of this current refugee crisis. Thousands of Muslims coming into America and Canada. Well, where is the Muslim organizations and where is the Muslim responsibility? This is an important lesson. And in fact, I just wanted to add one more story. I was reading in the New York Times today, and I mentioned this earlier. They had an article about an individual, a man in Toronto, Canada, recently retired man, named, I think it was Pierre Urban. Pierre Urban. So he's a recently retired man, 64 years old, and he had something like $28,000 that he had saved to buy a brand new boat. So he just recently retired, and he wanted to spend his retirement going out on a boat and fishing. He had $28,000. Rather than spending that $28,000 buying a boat, what he does is he donates it to sponsor a refugee to the Canadian government. A non-Muslim donating his own retirement money that he wants to have fun with for the sake of helping a Muslim refugee from Syria. So this is another example. Please give me a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So this is the lessons that we can learn from the second important migration. The lesson being that during times of adversity for other community members, we need to take care of the least advantaged, of the disadvantaged members of our community. And oftentimes, we as Muslims fail to take on this responsibility. And now I want to conclude by talking about the third migration that occurred in the early history of Islam, and that's the forced migration of our Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida from Medina to modern-day Iran, which back then was called Khurasan, specifically to the city of Fus. But first, please give me a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the Imam lived for the first 35 years of his life in the city of Medina. In the city of Medina, his primary responsibilities were in terms of community building. So he would go to the Masjid of the Prophet. Every day he would make ziyarah to his great-grandfather. Every day he would have lessons. His whole mission was to do the da'wah, or the community building for the followers of Ahlul Bayt. Because remember, this was a very difficult time for the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. Imam Musa al-Kadhim, Imam Ali's father, was imprisoned several times in Iraq and in other places. They were oppressed. So it was very difficult for them to talk about Islam, specifically during the time of Harun al-Rashid and during the time of al-Ma'mun and al-Amin. They were under tremendous pressure. Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida uses this as an opportunity to teach his community. So on a daily basis, he would have lessons in the Masjid of the Prophet, where he would teach his community members about the foundations of Islam. But what ended up happening is, after the death of Harun al-Rashid, there was a civil war between his sons, Ma'mun and Amin. Amin was in charge of modern-day Iraq. Ma'mun was in charge of Khurasan. But Ma'mun wanted to be in charge of the entire kingdom that was left over by his father. So what Ma'mun ends up doing is he kills his own brother, and he comes into power, and he takes over the Abbasid kingdom. Now the problem is that Al-Ma'mun lacks the legitimacy, meaning people say, why should we follow Ma'mun when he killed his own brother? He lacks legitimacy. So in order to enhance his own legitimacy as a governor, as a ruler, what he ends up doing is he uses this propaganda tool of appointing Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida as his Khalif, as his successor. he forcibly makes Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida migrate from Medina to Khurasan so that he could be the heir apparent. Essentially, after Al-Ma'mun dies, Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida becomes in charge. This was a propaganda tool used by Al-Ma'mun to enable legitimacy for his own rulership. Because how can you be a legitimate ruler and have killed your own brother? Now, many people will ask, why did Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, why did he not fight as his great-grandfather Imam al-Hussein fought? The answer here is that each of the Imams had their own particular strategy for dealing with the conditions of their time. During the time of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, it would have been more effective for him to serve in the government of Al-Ma'mun and to propagate the message of Ahlul Bayt rather than to fight. Meaning what? Meaning during the migration from Medina to Khurasan, Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida stops in modern-day Qom. And what does he do in Qom? It was during the time of Muharram. He holds the majalis for 10 days. According to our narrations, the first Imam to hold the majalis of Muharram for a period of 10 nights was Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. This is the first time that the majalis of Imam Hussein go outside of the city of Medina and were enabled to be spread. Meaning, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He enabled the forced migration of Ali ibn Musa Rida, what it also enabled is the spread of the message of Ahlul Bayt. It enabled the message of Ahlul Bayt to go into modern-day Qom, to go into modern-day Iran. And notice how the seed that was planted by Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida has grown into the modern-day followers of Ahlul Bayt in Iran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a greater hikmah, a greater amount of wisdom behind what we see. So anyway, during the time of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, many of his own Shia criticized Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. They would say, Imam Ali, you're a so-called Imam, but look at you, you're serving under a zalim, you're serving under an oppressor. Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, one time one of his so-called companions comes up to the Imam and says, how can you be an Imam and serve for a zalim like Al-Ma'mun? Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida responds very strategically and very logically. He asks them, who is better? Is a mu'min better or is a mushrik better? They say, well, obviously a mu'min or a Muslim is better than a mushrik. Then he asks them, well, what if I tell you that there was a prophet before me who served under a mushrik? They said, well, who is this prophet? He says, have you not read Surah Yusuf, where Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam says, قَالَ جَعَلَنِي عَلَى خَزَائِنَ الْأَرْضِ إِنِّي حَفِيظٌ عَلِيمٌ. He says, have you not remembered the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, who served as a governor in charge of the resources during the time he was serving under a mushrik? This is a prophet of Allah voluntarily serving under a mushrik because he recognized that there was a greater strategy. He says, what do you say about me, who's being forced to serve under Al-Ma'mun? So this is a very logical sort of response to these so-called individuals. That strategically, it doesn't always make sense to fight. Sometimes it makes sense to work within the system because this enables for the message to spread greater than if you're continually fighting. This is another lesson that we can learn from Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. And during the time that he was serving in the court of Al-Ma'mun, he was completely independent. Because Al-Ma'mun knew that his entire governorship depended on the existence of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. So he couldn't hurt or punish him in any way, because then the people would revolt against him. So Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida used this as an opportunity to spread the authentic teachings of Ahlul Bayt. He wrote many treatises. Probably the most important treatise that he wrote was something called Al-Risala al-Dhahabiyya, Imam Musa Rida. This is the medical epistle, or the medical risala, the medical message of Imam Musa Rida. How did this message come about? Al-Ma'mun, one day he gathers some of the great physicians and some of the great medical doctors of the time. He had a Hindu doctor, and a Syrian doctor, and a Jewish doctor. And each of them was talking about the state of medical knowledge at the time. Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida was silent the whole time. And then Al-Ma'mun asks Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, what do you have to say about the human body and what do you have to say about medicine? Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida goes on to write this document called Al-Risala al-Dhahabiyya. Al-Ma'mun reads it, the doctors read it. They become so impressed by it that they say this document needs to be written not in normal ink, but it needs to be written completely in gold. Meaning this is such a valuable document that the entire document needs to be written in gold, because this really represents the symbolic value of this document. This document talks about human anatomy, physiology, about the things that make the human body function properly, about the foods and the things that make the human body function improperly. Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida was engaged in this type of Islamic propagation, where he was talking about the message of Ahlul Bayt within the system of the governing system of Al-Ma'mun. And this is what enabled the message of Ahlul Bayt to spread into Khurasan. So the fourth lesson that we can learn from the migration, and specifically the migration of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, is that you should always be strategic about the opportunities that are given to you. Sometimes we don't think strategically and long term like Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. He could have fought openly against Al-Ma'mun, but that would have limited the spread of Islam into modern day Iran. Rather, what Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida did is he worked within the system to spread the message of Islam. So the final thing that we can learn from the migration of Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida is to always use the opportunities that Allah gives in front of you. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us learn from the lessons of the migrations of the Prophet, the early followers of Islam, and Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to strengthen Islam during these perceived times of difficulty, and to strengthen us to implement the examples of the Prophet and the Imam, so that we can enable the message of Islam to spread. رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَّسِينَا وَأَخْطَأْنَا رَبَّنَا وَلَا تَحْمِلْ عَلَيْنَا إِصْرًا كَمَا حَمَلْتَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِنَا رَبَّنَا وَلَا تُحَمِّلْنَا مَا لَا طَاقَةَ لَنَا بِهِ وَاعْفُ عَنَّا وَاغْفِرْ لَنَا وَارْحَمْنَا أَنْتَ مَوْلَانَا فَانصُرْنَا عَلَى الْقَوْمِ الْكَافِرِينَ.
اللهم صل على محمد.
I think Maulana was saying maybe we open it up for question and answers tonight. 5-10 minutes if there's any questions or answers.
MashaAllah, you're informative. You speak answered all the questions.
Alhamdulillah. Good. Yes.
Actually, I have a question about yesterday's lecture.
Yes.
In terms of ilm.
Yes.
That we're supposed to seek. The Prophet has mentioned that there is a type of ilm that is neither beneficial nor bad or harmful.
Yeah.
So in terms of ilm that is supposed to guide us towards to be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, does that include also ilm that you learn in school, or are we talking specifically about ilm that is spiritual or?
Yeah, that's a good point. So I didn't really clarify this point effectively, but I think the first category of ilm that I mentioned is the ayatul muhkama, or the firm signs, and I think this would be relevant to the things that you learn in school. So for example, you learn about chemistry or biology. These are all enabling you to learn about the firm signs of Allah. Mathematics is enabling you to learn about these things. History. So the category of physical material knowledge that you're learning in school, which would inevitably result in a degree, would fall under that first category. But if you just focus on that first category, meaning only focusing on getting a degree from a Western university, you're going to deny your potential in terms of your spiritual and your religious obligations. And that's where really the complete concept of ilm is really a complete holistic concept, not just focusing on the Western education type of learning, but complementing what you're learning in school with the spiritual and the religious knowledge that you pick up from Islam, essentially. And that's the complete definition of ilm. Yes.
Thank you for your great lecture. I have a question regarding the early Muslims who immigrated to Ethiopia. What happened to them after Prophet moved to Medina? Did they also moved to Medina?
It's a great question.
Or stayed there?
So some of them stayed there, and they built their own community. So the first message, oh yes, so the brother was asking what happened to the early Muslims who migrated to Ethiopia. When the Prophet migrated to Medina, did they migrate with the Prophet to Medina, or did they stay in Ethiopia? And what I was saying to the brother is that some of them stayed in Ethiopia, but some of them went to Medina. Probably the most prominent example is Ja'far ibn Abi Talib. He arrived in Medina on the day after the victory of Khaybar, and the Prophet ﷺ responds by saying, I don't know what is more pleasurable for me, seeing my cousin Ja'far again, or having defeated the mushrikeen on the battlefields of Khaybar. So this is the most prominent example of an individual that migrated to Ethiopia going back to Medina. So some of them went back to Medina and some of them stayed in Ethiopia.